Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey guys, it's Debbie Potts, the host of the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, and I am very excited to have a special guest on the show, Dr. Ben Bikman. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Physiology and Development of Biology at Brigham Young University. And I've heard him speak on other podcasts, and I emailed him right away, and I got him on my show. So I'm so excited because it goes hand in hand with our current conversations on how to burn fat, how to improve our health, our mitochondria, and how to perform performance as a low-carb athlete. And of course, we always want to focus, the big goal should be improving the aging process. So improving our health for the long term, for a future. Now, I want to pick his brain on how we can boost our mitochondria, the impacts of a high carb, high sugar diet on the body. And of course, you guys are mostly all low carb or thinking of low carb for training endurance athletes and just for day-to-day activity, that we should go lower carbs and a little more protein and fat that balances your blood sugar. Because really the main goal is to avoid the surges of insulin, that hormone that is released from the pancreas, to lower that blood glucose level. And where does it store that glucose? In fat cells. So I always think of insulin as a fat storage hormone, and glucagon is the hormone that's released to help release fat and use fat for fuel. So we want to decrease insulin and increase glucagon. But Ben Bikman is the man to talk about research. He's a scientist side of all this, and he works at BYU as his main job. He's also the co-owner of a new low-carb, high-protein, high-fat shake that is soon to be released called Health Code, HLTH Code. Pretty cool name. But Ben, he earned his Ph.D. in Bioenergetics and was a postdoctoral fellow at Duke National University of Singapore in metabolic disorders. Currently, his professional focus is as a scientist and an associate professor at Brigham Young University. And his goal is to bring a better understanding of the role of elevated insulin in regulating obesity and diabetes, including the relevance of ketones in mitochondria function. So right on along the way, his area is more about chronic illnesses, so not so much with athletes. And that's a conversation we'll talk about too, how we can apply this information to endurance athletes. And once again, I've come to the conclusion, no one's really researched this area of low carb, ketogenic, carnivore, female athletes, and the impact on our health if we are male or female endurance athlete, and as I was just saying, female. And female athletes, I think really we're learning a lot more about how we can maybe make those micro adjustments of how low carbohydrate we need to go to not cause additional stress to our body, to help improve our ability to burn fat for our main fuel and have good metabolic flexibility, but not cause additional sources of stress. So we need to really be careful, especially as women, but athletes, that we're not stressing our body too many ways. We have so many external stressors, and as I do work with clients individually, finding their internal hidden stressors. So hidden, we call hidden internal stressors because it stands for hidden hormone balance. I, immune function, D, digestion, detoxification, energy systems, and nervous system. So we identify your unique individual hidden internal stressors that become a chronic stressor. And we don't know about them unless we do well-chosen functional lab testing and clinically correlate all the data together to figure out the best program for you. So it's called DRESS, for Health Success Program. The founder, Reed Davis, likes to have these acronyms. So it's DRESS, stands for diet, rest, exercise, stress, and supplements. And as I keep telling my clients that I'm coaching, you can't out-exercise a bad diet. You can't out-supplement bad lifestyle habits. And we need to find that right amount, that we're working on lifestyle habits to improve our health, to improve longevity, but also your athletic performance. Really important to have proper sleep because we want to recover and repair so we can have an amazing workout the next day and feel energetic all day long and be able to survive the battles that we have of daily life activities and requirements. That we need to be energetic when we're with our family. We need to be on at work and have a clear mind and, have sense of well-being, gratitude, happiness, and not have the mood swings. And all that can go on from having too much external and internal stress. It accumulates in your beaker of stress. So Ben will help us kind of identify some external stressors and internal hidden stressors, how we can optimize our health as generally male and females. But what happens if we are an endurance athlete? What do we need to look at more so to be healthy and improve our longevity, our aging process? But the female athlete. So, I think this is an area that hopefully I can get him to help us get some more research on this performance gains and longevity for athletes, because we're curious. We all want to know, what should I eat? How much should I eat? How many carbs should I have? Should I be carnivore? Should I be keto? Should I fast? How long should I fast? When is too long, too little, too much? You don't know, and nobody knows because you are an individual. As we find out, it's N equals 1. We have kind of a template to start with, and we need to make those micro adjustments with fasting and our carbohydrate intake. And the main goal, as I always say, is to eat real food. Get rid of the processed foods. Get rid of the vegetable oils, the canola oil. Get rid of the fast foods and anything with the barcode. And ideally, just eat real food and have the right ratio of carbs, fat, and protein that give you energy, that give you're in a good mood. You don't have any digestion problems. You got to figure out what works for you. So when I'm coaching clients, I look at their genetic profile, import your raw genetic data into DNA Fit, do a food sensitivity lab, and we run some gut biome tests, look at your microbiome diversity of your good bacteria. We look at your dysbiosis, look at bacteria, parasite infections, fungal infections. And then we want to look at, do you have leaky gut? How's your gut health? Are you reactive to gluten, dairy? All those kind of things we want to look at. And your organic acid test. Look at your neurotransmitter production. Look at your hormone panel and put all that together. So I find it super fascinating to really put all this information together as I'm starting to do with my clients right now. I only take up to 5 clients for each month, and it's a 90-day program, and then you can go on or meet monthly, whatever you want to do. But just super cool. But I like having Ben on this show to kind of get more of the research side of it and pick his brain. He's super intelligent, as everyone lately has been just amazing, knowledgeable people on this show on our Monday episodes. And then you have me Wednesday, Fridays. But his passion is to help get a better understanding of the pathogenic side of insulin, and he will share his insight on that. And we'll talk about insulin resistance and how it's related to every chronic disease. And he has a new book coming out about why we get sick. And he also talks about ketones, mitochondria, fasting. And we ran out of time, of course, to get really into the mTOR AMPK pathway I want to talk more about. But I'll try to get all the links in the show notes. So mostly we're going to dive into insulin resistance. How can we detect it and what can we do about it? So I'm sure you'll find lots of great information in this episode. You can learn more about Ben Bikman on his social media posts. His last name is spelled Bikman. So enjoy the show and send me your questions when we are done, and let us know what you would like to ask Ben, and hopefully we can get Ben Bikman back on the show for follow-up episode. All right, enjoy. Let's bring on Ben. Hey everyone, I'm so excited to dive into mitochondria and blood glucose regulation, fasting, athletes, all this information with Ben. And I'm happy that you're able to come on my show today because I've been listening to you and following your information, and I just want to share you with all of our listeners.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
So talk a little bit about your passion and your purpose and what your why is in your world.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. My focus has, it started and has continued to be an interest in the hormone insulin, and in particular, the pathogenic side of insulin. Too often, from my view, this is a hormone that's been overlooked, that it's looked at as essentially just a surrogate for glucose. And so from the perspective of the clinician, you have a health practitioner that's just simply tracking the patient's glucose with very little regard for what insulin's doing. And the great tragedy there is that the longer we overlook insulin, the later we detect problems, and we will treat them the wrong way. So I guess I'm an insulin guy, and it's my strong opinion that insulin is relevant for virtually all metabolic regulation, including metabolic disorders like obesity and diabetes and the numerous cardiometabolic problems that we're suffering from nowadays.
And that's connected, I'm sure, to mitochondria function as well somehow, right?
Oh yeah, most certainly. Yeah. In fact, that's a bit of a bidirectional series of events where insulin regulates mitochondrial function and production, and then in turn, the function of the mitochondria can alter how the cell is responding to insulin. So healthy mitochondria help the cell maintain healthy insulin sensitivity, and then dysfunctional or altered mitochondria that aren't working normally can potentiate insulin resistance in the cell. So the cell is not responding to insulin the way it ought to.
Because I share with everyone, I wrote my book, Life is Not a Race, in 2015, and I was doing Ironman since 2001 and marathons, and I was doing metabolic efficiency training and eating starting back in 2005. And in 2013, I got adrenal exhaustion, quote, air quotes around that.
Yeah.
That. But it's really funny going into this research the last 5 years from my own journey. I was low carb. I was doing low heart rate. I was, able to burn high percentage of fat at 160 heart rate, blah, blah, blah. My point is I was low carb, but I was still insulin resistant. And I try to keep telling athletes that you can be low carb, eating keto, being carnivore now. A lot of people are doing that, but you can still create insulin resistance because of, get your opinion. But for me, I'm finding our chronic stressors from external, from our environment or from our lifestyle, but then internal stressors that are hidden that we don't know about can cause it. So what have you found, what impacts our insulin and our insulin resistance, which impacts, I'm sure, our mitochondria, because I talk about fat loss, performance, longevity. So help us make the connection pieces of the puzzle together.
Yeah, well, I like what you mentioned there. There are myriad causes of insulin resistance. And the importance of this is that insulin resistance is the single most common non-infectious health disorder in the world. It affects potentially up to 88% of adults in the U.S. That was a study published at the end of last year, finding that 88% of U.S. adults are metabolically unfit. So they fail one of the aspects of the metabolic syndrome. And all of those are related to insulin resistance. So it is worthwhile to understand where is this problem coming from. And you mentioning stress is appropriate. It is well known, very well understood, the biochemical pathways whereby the main stress hormone, namely cortisol, will induce insulin resistance in the body. And Now, mind you, cortisol does far more than just cause insulin resistance. It wreaks absolute havoc all over. But suffice it to say, cortisol can induce insulin resistance. The other kind of sidekick to cortisol when we talk about stress hormones is epinephrine. Epinephrine can induce insulin resistance. So the two main stress hormones are, they antagonize the effects of insulin in the body, and can thus result chronically could stimulate a state of insulin resistance. Inflammation itself can cause insulin resistance. Oxidative stress is implicated in causing insulin resistance as well. And so all of these could be relevant to someone, even if they're eating a low carb diet. The beauty of the low carb diet is that it addresses one of the main causes, which is hyperinsulinemia itself. Hyperinsulinemia has been shown to directly cause insulin resistance in fat cells and in muscle cells. And that matters for the athlete. The athlete needs the muscle to be responsive to insulin, not only to facilitate nutrient uptake, although there are some back doors with that, but also to facilitate recovery and growth of the muscle. So suffice it to say, there are multiple pathways that cause insulin resistance, and many of them are going to come into play with regards to someone who's experiencing chronic stress, whether it is a physical stressor like an illness or injury or overtraining, or whether it is an emotional stressor. Some of the same events are going to be present across those two situations.
Yeah, emotional stressors is a big one. I did an episode a few weeks ago on that, just myself talking about how we're not aware of what stress is coming from. And people, I do health coaching that's 90 days and really dive deep with people, because I'm not a therapist, but you have to peel the layers of onion to kind of get to the root of the person, what's going on with them. And a lot of times people have just different life stresses, spouse stresses, relatives. Oh, yeah. It's just amazing how it all accumulates into one funnel, and your body doesn't have a file folder of this.
No. And nowadays it doesn't end. It is so difficult to step away from that. And one of my great challenges as a father, husband with a relatively young family, is when I get home, I have to just put my phone away, turn it off. The reason I don't have a smartwatch, if that's what they're called even, is because I don't want that on me. I don't want to be pinged and dinged and whatever. I want to, when I get home, I want to be home. I want to make sure that I'm giving my children and my wife my best self. And if I am allowing myself to get distracted, I'll see an email pop up. And even if I say, I'm not going to read, I'm not going to address it now, the moment I see it, it has just, for me personally, and I tend to kind of run a little high on the sort of anxiety meter, maybe other people can do this and they're fine, but I'll see that little alert. And even though I'm telling myself, no, I'm home, I'm not going to look at it. No, it's still nagging at me now. And then I'm going to be a little more impatient with my family. I'm going to be a little more anxious to just get to my laptop as soon as I can and address that, just because I saw it there. And so yes, we live in a world where there are constant stressors, and we have to either find a way to truly adapt, in that we can allow ourselves to be pinged or dinged or informed, alerted, notified, and not have it turn us, sort of flip those switches, or we have to find a way to make sure the flip just doesn't get switched until we need it to be switched at work.
I know. I preach this every week, I think, because it drives me nuts. And I, personal trainer for 25 years. And when people got those Apple Watches, I'm like, focus. I take it, I turn it on their wrist. Like every time they have that ding, and I've never had any of that. I disable everything on my cell phone too. So there's just constant distraction. So how does this all relate to insulin resistance? And people struggle. I think I keep hearing and reading and paying attention. People struggle with fat loss.
Yeah.
Even though they're exercising, they're doing low carb, they're doing fasting. But I was just doing a athletic performance podcast. People still don't lose weight. And they're like, okay, what am I doing? I haven't eaten all day, and I had one meal a day. I'm doing carnivore. I'm doing low carb. I'm doing keto. And there's no fat loss coming off.
Yeah. Well, that is a tricky situation. Now, it is possible. So if someone is insulin resistant, it's not that they can't lose weight. They absolutely can, without question. We published a case study just last year finding incredible weight loss in full-blown type 2 diabetics over just 90 days. But if someone is insulin resistant, it does induce this really fascinating situation of metabolic inflexibility. So I suspect your listeners have heard this to some degree.
Yeah.
We want to be what is called metabolically flexible. So we want to be able to shift between fuels. We're a hybrid engine. We want the human metabolism to be able to burn both sugar or blood sugar or blood glucose more accurately, and fat. So we want to be able to shift between the two. Burn sugar when we need to, when after a meal, and then burn fat when we're not eating. The problem with someone who's insulin resistant is that they're metabolically inflexible. They are stuck in sugar burning mode. And their bodies, if you start to fast this person, they stay in sugar burning mode. Whereas the insulin sensitive person starts to shift over the few hours, and they then switch their metabolism to rely more predominantly on fat metabolism. Now, mind you, of course, it's never just one or the other 100%. It's always a mix of the two. It's just which one predominates. And so the insulin resistant person is stuck in sugar burning mode, and that is reflective of the chronically elevated insulin. Insulin controls the levers of metabolism or fuel use. If insulin is high, the body's in sugar burning mode, and that is essentially what's happening with insulin resistance all the time. And then if insulin is low, the body is in fat burning mode or relies more predominantly on fat. And in that state, when insulin is low for a prolonged period of time, getting on the order of 16 plus hours-ish, depending on the person, the body will be in such an exaggerate or high state of fat burning that the body starts to make ketones from some of that burned fat. And that is why a ketogenic diet can be so helpful with regards to insulin resistance and insulin control, because merely if you're making ketones, that means your insulin has come down to probably a really good level. And so that becomes one of the values of measuring ketones in someone, if they chose to do so. It is that the ketones are an inverse indicator of insulin levels. If ketones are higher, that means insulin is low.
Mm-hmm. So do you test people using keto mojo kind of blood sugar glucose testing monitor? How do you know if you have, well, back up, how do you know if you have insulin resistant issues, and how do you detect it?
Yeah, that's a great question. How can we at home detect this most common of all problems? I often will just break it down into two definitions or two simple metrics. One, does someone have higher than normal blood pressure? And then two, are they overweight? Now that can mean a lot of things depending on the person, of course, but those two things alone, if someone is fatter than they think they ought to be, that's a tricky definition because some people can be a little hard on themselves. But if someone is overweight and if they have high blood pressure, they are most certainly insulin resistant. And then we can go a little further. If a man has erectile dysfunction, if a woman has polycystic ovarian syndrome, so two kind of infertility reproductive disorders in men and women respectively, those are both strong warning signs, especially PCOS in women. That is a disease of insulin resistance at the ovaries, affecting estrogen production, essentially not allowing the ovaries to make estrogens, but that's a little beside the point. Anyway, those are some common warning signs. Another one is the skin, where if the person has little skin tags, these teeny little bumps of skin at their armpits or around the skin fold of the neck, if they have a little bit of a chubby neck around the neck, and if they have dark patches of skin. Now, I am covered with freckles, so I don't mean freckles, but there's a situation called acanthosis nigricans, which are kind of like big freckles. And if someone has those kind of dark little patches, then that's also a warning sign of insulin resistance.
So if you can test it, and, what do we do next about it? So if we find, all right, I have all the symptoms you're talking about of insulin resistance, what do people do next?
Yeah, so the evidence seems quite clear in humans that if in the studies that have compared people on low carbohydrate versus high carbohydrate, so low carbohydrate, high fat diet versus a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, the low carbohydrate, high fat diet will bring insulin down much faster and to a much higher degree than a high carbohydrate diet. And that to me is a very important and healthy adjustment just to really indicate how relevant this can be. I mentioned this study a moment ago, and I'll elaborate now. Last year, working with the clinic nearby the university, we had 11 women volunteer to participate in a 90-day study, which was just simply getting dietary advice on following a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. Now, relevant here is that these women were all insulin resistant, in fact, to the point of type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is a state of prolonged insulin resistance. The body has become essentially so resistant to its own insulin that it can no longer keep its blood glucose levels in check. And that, insofar as insulin, one of its main actions is to reduce blood glucose. So type 2 diabetes is when the insulin has been high for a long time, and now the glucose is starting to climb as well. Well, within 90 days, their HbA1c levels, so that's a typical marker of diabetes, if it's above around 6.5%, it went from 8.9%, I think it went down to 5.6. So they were, for all intents and purposes, no longer diabetic after just 90 days on a ketogenic diet. And Jason Fung, the kind of godfather of intermittent fasting, he has published some case reports finding that, and Eric Westman too, is a physician out of Duke University, that even if someone is an insulin dependent type 2 diabetic, they become so insulin sensitive so quickly, or their needs for insulin go down so quickly, that if they're treating themselves, if they're on insulin therapy, they have to start to half the dose of their insulin immediately within just the first day. And then within the next few weeks, they typically can get off their insulin altogether. That's pretty powerful, and it just reflects how quickly this can happen.
So what I'm finding, someone pointed out to me, all these studies have huge health benefits. People with chronic disease, doing low carb, managing your insulin levels, your blood sugar, but they're not done on athletes, except for the faster study, but that was all men. There's not a lot of information on athletes, endurance athletes.
You're right.
Or women. So how do we apply all this information? How do, the Goldilocks effect, I say, not too much, not too little, because everyone thinks more is better, especially competitive type A personalities. So how do we apply this info?
Yeah, what a great question. And you are absolutely right by prefacing that question with the absolute fact that everything I say over the next couple of minutes is pure speculation, because I am unaware of any data to support this. And as a scientist, I really like to know, I like to have a study in mind if I'm going to say something, and there are none here. My thought on this is that I can't help but think of a situation that kind of emulates what this athlete Zach Bitter is doing. Now Zach Bitter, people may know, he
did on a show last year.
Okay, yeah. So he's the world record holder for the longest distance over 24 hours and for the fastest 100 miles. I think he has both of those. He's just such an overachiever. One wasn't enough. So what he does, from what I understand, is he essentially lives a low carbohydrate lifestyle, but then when he trains, he will train with strategic doses of glucose. And so maybe one way of applying this in a broader sense is perhaps this idea of carb cycling. And I'm sure everyone's heard of this. I'm such an advocate of a diet that keeps insulin in control, which in its easiest form is a diet that restricts especially refined carbohydrates, not zero carbohydrate necessarily, but just refined. And then the person will kind of dose in the carbohydrate very strategically. Like they know that they're going to go perform. They're going to have this exercise session. Well, then dose this in. But the beauty of that situation potentially is that you are allowing your body, you're training your body to use fat very well. And you have the mitochondrial density to use fat very well. And that comes from a ketogenic state where you are relying almost completely on your mitochondria for burning fat and ketones to a lesser degree. And then by putting in the glucose, you're reminding the body almost that there is this alternative pathway that it can rely on as intensities go up. And the body will, of course, rely on that very readily. So that might be one way to do it. So someone's adhering to a generally low carb diet, but then cycling in these carbohydrates either on given days or within a given workout, depending on the length and intensity of the workout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what I just did I just actually released an hour-long podcast of just talking about this myself, because N=1, as we're saying, there's no research data on this. And everyone, especially females that don't have this data, they're like, okay, if this isn't, fasting, low carb isn't ideal for females, if we're putting our hormones at risk to create hormone imbalances and gain weight, what should you do? How much carbs should I have? And there's nothing specific really to say. I would suggest measuring your blood sugar, keep that balance, but yeah, maybe the 5-2 that you're doing more on off. And I keep going back to the Goldilocks effect for everything, and figuring out what, the hormetic stressors we talk about. Just, it's a little burst, on, off, like a water faucet. Turn it on, turn it off, instead of running it nonstop. And I'm thinking, what if that's what we're doing? If more is better. So if people are fasting 16, 24 hours every day, and they're doing, 50 grams of carbs to 0, because all my friends are doing carnivore now. So they're saying carbs are not necessary. So the endurance athlete is like, okay, that's what so-and-so is doing. I'm going to do that too. But am I causing more damage than good? And so I think cyclical training of all this might be where to start.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yet I would say if a person is experiencing benefits with one particular strategy over another, then don't overcomplicate it. That if they found something that works, well, then I would pat them on the back. But if someone is still trying to find a system that works, and perhaps some of this insight could be helpful, this idea of helping the body learn to burn fat at ever higher intensities, which can come from training at least occasionally in a low carb state, and then sort of dosing in this glucose strategically, perhaps, to kind of get that ergogenic benefit.
Mm-hmm. So you're writing a book on why we get sick, and that's related to more the insulin resistance and chronic disease. Does that go into, keto and carnivore and taking out carbs? Are carbs needed? What's kind of your
opinion? Well, thanks. So I have that book coming out. It's available for pre-order now. And Why We Get Sick is essentially the scientists' effort to mention that, hey, there's this disorder that is taking over the world and almost no one knows anything about it. That's insulin resistance. And so what is insulin resistance? Why does it matter, and what to do about it? And the why does it matter is really devoted to all the many chronic diseases that come from insulin resistance, either directly or tangentially. Things like Alzheimer's disease, migraines, heart disease, atherosclerosis, heart failure, reproductive disorders, joint and muscle disorders, many. And I cite, of course, studies for all of that. And then in the what to do about it, which you allude to, in that section, without a doubt, a low-carb diet works. It is extremely effective. But so too can be a high-carb, low-fat diet if it's used well. And it's focusing on real carbohydrate sources. What the danger in a low-fat diet, a high-carb, low-fat, is that still allows the person to eat a lot of junk food. And so I often clarify by saying, if it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, then be careful with it. And that's really the common ground between low carb and even a smart vegetarian diet, is that they ought to both be avoiding processed foods. If that's happening, then boy, that's a really strong common foundation. I tend to favor a low carb approach simply due to the efficacy, and because it's allowing the person to focus on the actual essential parts of a human diet. There are essential fats, there are essential amino acids, and you're going to most certainly get them on a low carb diet. A low fat diet, you could, if vegetarian perhaps, and most certainly vegan, you will be deficient in a vegan diet. And so the person just has to be smart enough to know, and wealthy enough, frankly, to afford the supplements that they need.
Mm-hmm. So in nutritional therapy, Paul Chek is a holistic lifestyle coach, Keon coach, and I've done functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. What I've learned from every program, that I don't think enough people talk about out in social media is bioindividuality. And as we said, N=1, that there isn't the perfect diet for everyone. You have to kind of micro adjust, like the dial up, dial down, to figure out fine tuning your food, macronutrients, to feel good, to have a great mood, to have, energy after you eat for hours. And I think a lot of people forget to pay attention to how they feel instead of counting macros and being obsessed with that. So I find it becomes a diet that people are like, constantly focused on these numbers and not going by, how do you feel? Does it make you happy? Do you have to have cravings for anything? And I think, we look at metabolic typing. And so what do you find for people to really get over the obsessiveness of keeping all this data and make it a lifestyle and a journey and just intuitive nutrition?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's not something I'm overly familiar with. But I can appreciate the efficacy of that. But then the scientist in me would just slightly worry. I worry a little bit of sort of the feelings part of it, because biochemistry doesn't care about feelings. But I don't mean to be derogatory about it.
It's okay.
If someone, so I think there can be value, no doubt. If someone can be at peace with what they're doing, well, boy, then they've really reached the peak. I mean, that's the peak of just contentment. But I do think in some instances there is the person needs to be uncomfortable with the change they're making, because it was comfort that got them where they are. And so there has to be an upsetting of the balance, and that ought to be uncomfortable. It ought to be and sometimes I don't mean to use this word too heavily, but a painful transition to get to a new normal where they want to get. But nevertheless, but even that can come with a contentment, a person who realizes a challenge lays ahead of them, and they're able to develop a sufficient support structure, which is so important. If they can have that positive pressure around them, it makes it so much easier to make that uncomfortable transition. But that is important. I have known dozens of people over the years who really want to commit to altering their diet. And it is so disappointing to see their, quote, support group start to sabotage them, where if it's a college student and the roommates don't like the change this person is making, the spouse doesn't like the change this person is making, because it reflects negatively on them. They don't like seeing a person make a change that they know they should make. And so they perhaps, if not so obviously, attempt to sabotage that. That person is generally going to be doomed. They have to have a support structure. And if they can convince their loved ones to love them enough to give them the support they're asking for, then generally that's going to come with a much higher degree of emotional contentment with that transition. But I don't really know anything about that, frankly, as a scientist. So I need to clarify.
I'll go back to the science part. But so my point was, listening intuitive nutrition is based on eating the right ratio of good, clean proteins and healthy fats and low carb to figure out the percentage that you should have to balance your blood sugar. So the main goal we always teach people is, eat the macronutrients to balance your blood sugar and avoid the insulin surges. So, eat
well said.
Organic, eat clean, eat real food, not the processed junk food, inflammatory oils and all the garbage, but eat good quality food so you feel good. I just feel like when it gets to that emotional part of people counting calories, it's got to be a diet. And so
I totally agree. I think counting calories is a terrible idea. Terrible. That is a person who's doomed to fail in most instances, because the tedium will simply kill them.
So I want to move on because I know we're going to run out of time. I want to talk about how this all connects with mitochondria, because we've got lots of podcast episodes coming up with Dr. Sarah Myhill, and I've talked to MitoQ in the past, and I'm just, my own personal interest and curiosity is the role of mitochondria in our ability to optimize our health, for fat loss, for longevity. And I find
with my chronic fatigue background and HP axis dysfunction, it's so much information coming out there about the mitochondria. So tell us kind of what we can use as athletes and people that are usually type A and low carb. How can they use some new data?
Yeah, so with that, mitochondria, as your listeners undoubtedly know, that is the part of the cell that is responsible for producing the bulk of all energy. Now, there is an alternative method where glucose can be used independently for energy of the mitochondria, but by and large, the mitochondria are going to be that unavoidable piece of the puzzle, and they're certainly going to be a boost, a necessary part of the endurance athlete. There's no avoiding that. The power athlete can bypass it to a large degree, but nevertheless, the mitochondria are a requisite for maintain long-term energy production. They are absolutely essential for fat metabolism and ketone metabolism. If someone wants to train their body to use fat at higher intensities, which is what the ketogenic or fat-adapted athlete is doing, then a lot of that is increasing the amount of the mitochondria they have, and then also putting together the metabolic or rather enzymatic machinery to facilitate the breakdown, the catabolism of the fat within the mitochondria. So there are numerous biochemical processes, and the person, especially training in a ketogenic state, is presumably going to be upregulating all of those pathways. So again, allowing the body to burn fat and ketones at ever higher intensities. Now, what's important about this, at the beginning of our conversation, you'd mentioned this, I think you said metabolic efficiency. That's always a buzzword for me, because it is an interesting dichotomy within the human body, where in some instances we want the metabolism, or specifically the mitochondria, to be very efficient. In other instances, we want it to be rather inefficient. And I'll just elaborate briefly. If mitochondria are very efficient, then it will break down fats, for example, and very, very well produce energy from that. So there'll be very little waste. And so it'll only break down what it needs to break down for the sake of meeting the energetic needs of the cell. What is interesting is that we're about to publish a paper, not to get off topic, I hope it's not too far off topic. We're about to publish a paper in various models, individual fat cells, rodent fat tissue, and human fat tissue, where over the last year we published a different paper, and then the follow-up now that I'll mention. But what we found is that ketones actually help the muscle maintain this optimal metabolic efficiency. So the muscle is not wasting energy. It is only breaking down what it needs to break down according to its energetic needs. But interestingly, in contrast, ketones are inducing a metabolic inefficiency at the fat tissue. So the fat tissue, which has a very low metabolic rate, roughly 1/10 of what the muscle has, the fat tissue starts to increase its metabolic rate inefficiently. So now it's burning fat, just not because of any need in the fat cell, it's just burning it to create heat. And heat is a waste product chemically, biochemically speaking. So that represents an inefficiency where there's a waste. And so the ketones are inducing this energetic wasting at the fat cells. And we see that the metabolic rate is essentially doubled or tripled in fat tissue when the fat cells are seeing ketones. So in other words, a person in ketosis, their fat tissue has a roughly doubled or tripled metabolic rate. And that is an inefficiency there. It's not producing more energy from it in the form of chemical energy for the body to use. It's wasting that energy in the form of heat. So anyway, even then the mitochondria become relevant. This idea of we want our mitochondria in the athlete to be very efficient in the muscle, and yet in the fat cell, mind you, the athlete has, especially the higher level athlete, has so little fat tissue anyway that it doesn't really matter. But in the person who's metabolically challenged, so to speak, and has a lot of fat tissue, that then becomes a very meaningful outlet where they can sort of take advantage of that metabolic phenomenon of ketones having the fat cells start to idle. The RPMs start to idle a little faster.
So are these studies done on men and women that you're going from?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, so we use male and female rats and male and female humans.
And have you done I'm curious on research on the female athlete, but also HP axis dysfunction, or if they have hormone imbalances. And have you done any testing? Because I'm just curious with, all right, this sounds great, but what if you have complete HP axis dysfunction and your body is a total metabolic chaos?
Yeah. I would have to know what that means. I mean, I'm familiar with hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I teach that topic as a professor.
Okay.
And endocrinology is my favorite topic. To invoke this terminology of sort of HPA dysfunction, I don't know what that means, strictly speaking. But if someone has alterations in cortisol production, in particular, that is going to make numerous changes throughout the body, including changes in fat metabolism, where it is blocking lipolysis at certain fat depots. It's fascinating, actually. Cortisol results in this overall movement of fat. I don't mean literal movement. I don't mean the fat creeping along underneath their skin, but it will induce this lipolysis or breakdown of fat in the limbs, like on the arms or buttocks or hips in someone, and then it will increase fat storage centrally, so around the belly, around the abdominal cavity, around the face and neck. And so there's this, anyway, it'll also break down muscle. But cortisol puts the body into a state of not wanting to, effectively break down energy. And if that's sort of what you're touching on, then I think that becomes very relevant. Now, mind you, the adrenal glands have to do with more than just even sugar control. They intimately control water and salt regulation, and salt has numerous effects throughout the body. The adrenal glands also are a site of sex hormone production as well. So even those sort of secondary glands when it comes to sex hormones, secondary being that they're far behind the gonads, testes and ovaries. But yeah, if someone has adrenal glands that are not responding properly to upstream signals, in particular, say those coming from the hypothalamus, the pituitary, which is its immediate kind of controller, then that's going to be disastrous. And we see that just how disastrous that can be in overt adrenal gland diseases like Cushing syndrome, Cushing disease, and others with names I can't remember at the moment, but it is disastrous what happens to these people. The collagen breakdown of connective tissue and skin, how cortisol results in the breakdown of collagen. Anyway, it's a terrible situation.
See, that's kind of what I'm trying to get more information out to people, because I find that's what happened to me. I gained 30 pounds in just a few months from being, elite athlete, and then look like I've been sitting on the sofa having cookies and ice cream every day. I completely had my body transform in just a short amount of time, and it felt like overnight. So my purpose now is to help other people avoid going through what I went through, starting back in 2013. And so I think a lot of this information gets confusing out there because, yes, keto, low carb, and athletes fat adapted, metabolic flexibility, efficiency. But then what if you have HP axis stuff, cortisol imbalances and DHA and all your hormones? Because that's a whole nother topic to really dive into, because I think so many people are struggling with those issues and they're not aware of it. So then they lay on low carb, keto eating, one meal a day. They're training 2-3 times a day, and they're just living life as a race, as I say. So then, have this total cascade of events happening that we're actually creating more problems and figure out how to, really improve the whole person from the inside out.
Right. Yeah, I could see, I could imagine, depending on the person, where that is a different sort of metabolic stress, more long-term fasting or very low carb diets. One of cortisol's actions is to increase blood glucose, and it's supposed to do that. But perhaps there are some people where, even though there's evidence to show that cortisol levels aren't different, it's not too hard to imagine a situation where a person adopts a low carb ketogenic diet and the cortisol is going too high in an effort to maintain blood glucose. And then there are consequences to that, most especially muscle and collagen breakdown.
So do you look at genetics at all? when you're working in
I do
studies?
not. No, that's beyond the scope of my lab.
Yeah, so you have to keep it specific. I mean, I have that trouble. It's like, there's so much to look at. What do I just focus on?
Yeah, there is.
It gets, rabbit holes everywhere.
Yes.
So what can we do, before your book comes out, or any suggestions how to really work on improving our insulin resistance, signs and symptoms?
Yeah. So I'd mentioned earlier the value of a low carbohydrate diet. And so maybe I'll play off that a little more. If someone can, I consider there are sort of four pillars here, really three, but then an important fourth. One is to control carbohydrates, and that does not mean none. It doesn't even have to mean very low, but it does mean you probably need to eat less than the average American is, where we're eating more of our calories from carbohydrates than presumably, and by all accounts, more than ever before. Focus on real carbohydrates, real fruits and vegetables in particular, and the less sugary ones, the better, because some fruits nowadays are profoundly sugary, and that's how they're literally designed to be. And then next is prioritize protein. Make sure the person is getting sufficient protein, ideally from real sources and ideally from animal sources, which is superior by every metric to any other source, any plant source. The availability of the protein, the complement of amino acids in those proteins. So prioritize protein, make sure they're getting enough. And that's typically 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. And then fill with fat. Let the rest of those calories be from fat, natural fat. Typically, I often say that is going to come with the protein. If we eat protein the way God intended, it comes with fat. And so eat it that way. That's probably something we were built to do. We certainly evolved on that kind of food. And then lastly, it is paying attention to the clock. And it is okay for someone not to eat breakfast. For example, if someone wakes up and they just sort of do a self-check and thinking, I'm not really that hungry right now, well, then don't eat it. Have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And I would say the person who wants to lose weight, not that this is necessarily your listeners, then avoid the temptation to add too much fat to things. Not that it can't be used well, but try not to add too much fat to your coffee or to whatever else the person's drinking. There can be therapeutic amounts, I think, especially of coconut oil, and the ketogenic benefits with brain function there, or the ketogenic effects and the benefits on the brain. But that's it. So control carbs, prioritize protein, fill with fat, and watch the clock. So this degree of occasional intermittent fasting can be very effective.
So final question then on fasting. What's ideal for you and what's too little or too much, and optimal how often?
Yeah, you're trying to put me, get a position statement for me. So I do believe that intermittent fasting can be extraordinarily effective at improving metabolic health. The results from limited case studies and limited more randomized clinical studies really make that clear, that the benefits are real. And I am an advocate of giving the body a break from eating, especially in our current environment where the person is eating every 2 to 3 hours. We do not need to do that. We are not built to constantly be filling up the energy tank in the body. We ought to be able to run those tanks down, especially the glucose tank in the liver, the glycogen. I believe there's a value in letting that tank get down to empty and get in, and then we can fill it back up. So that's going to happen if someone just is occasionally skipping a meal on either end of the day, breakfast or dinner. For me personally, I find it much easier to fast through breakfast, simply, although I think there's a real value to fasting through dinner. Just socially, it doesn't work. If I don't eat breakfast with my family, it's fine. My kids don't notice. I typically make breakfast for the family. We're all there in the kitchen, doing our typical morning routine. If I'm not eating the breakfast that I've made for the kids, which is typically healthy anyway, they don't notice. They don't care one bit. But if I'm not eating dinner, that's weird. Then everyone notices, and I don't want that to be the culture in my family. So I typically will fast through dinner. For me personally, metabolically healthy and I want to stay that way, it's an easy thing to do. And then around once a week, I'll do about a full 24-hour fast, just to kind of make sure that my mind is in charge of my body and that I still have the ability to tell myself not to eat even when I start to get a little hungry. I just like to know that I have that degree of discipline or self-control.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And you exercise
every day.
Every day.
Not a long time though. I only do about 30 minutes a day. Now,
Perfect.
Someone would say, yeah, it shows, Ben, you're pretty petite. I am, unfortunately, but I don't go very long. And that's partly due to kind of a fatherly sense of guilt or husband sense of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
That to me seems like a somewhat selfish pursuit. Not totally, because I'm a better husband and father. But my thought is if I'm exercising for more than about 30 minutes, that's time I ought to be spending with my family. And so I just really make it count and then get back to the other things that demand my time, whether it's work, church, or family.
Good job. Well, I was just doing a podcast on less is more for your workouts. People that spend an hour on the cardio machines, it's wasted time. You're not really getting that much out of that.
No, that's right. Yeah, I just make it count. I do very short
Mm-hmm.
rests, generally nothing more than about 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds tops.
Mm-hmm.
And then every set essentially is going to failure. Not that I'm counting. I do calisthenics, so body weight based exercises. It may be that I'm just going to hop up and do as many pull-ups or muscle ups as I can, or I'm going to hold a position for as long as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is, I'm not counting anything. I'm just doing it.
Good. I love that. You're a good role model. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge. And I think everyone should head to, we've got social media, but no website. That's easy.
Yeah, no website. No, not yet. Maybe someday.
It's a lot of work when you have a website. You always have to update it.
Yeah,
so where can people find you and find your book that's coming out and your shakes?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thanks. So social media, my purpose there is really exclusively to just share research. It's not me doing anything sort of with myself. It's either a short little video clip of me talking about a paper or just sharing the paper itself. That's on Instagram and Twitter. It's Ben Bikman, Ph.D. No C in Bikman, just Bikman, Ben Bikman, Ph.D. And then on Facebook, it's Dr. Bikman. And then, the book is available for sale anywhere books are sold, and it'll be released in July. And then, I have a shake coming out. So full disclosure, a low carb, high protein, high fat shake. And that's going to be available hopefully in the next couple months at Health Code, HLTH Health Code.
Good. Well, I look forward to reading your book and learning more about all this, and keep me in mind when you're finding good research for athletes, because I'm speaking on the low carb cruise and KetoCon, and
that sounds fun.
How to improve performance and longevity for the low carb athlete. So I need to collect my research articles to share.
Yeah, I'll be your research mule, your science mule here.
Perfect. Send it over. All right. Thank you for your time. And we love learning this information. So keep following you guys on social media, and we can get more on how to improve our performance and longevity.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepotts.net. You can help us to continue to grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.